put out his eyes.
Man, we've sure come a long way. Total War has been around the block for a long time now. It debuted just over 20 years ago with this game that no one has ever played, and has been widely loved around the world forever since. Mostly. Because I can't stop myself and the scope of my videos keeps ballooning bigger and bigger, this video took forever, so subscribe or some shit, I don't even know. Total War as a franchise has definitely gone through some iterations. We are, after all, looking at about 20 years of evolution, and lots of steps back in some cases. These titles all have their merits, but I would like to focus on other games for this video, just because if I did focus on all of these games, this video wouldn't come out until about February of next year. Okay, but these games right here, this is where we get to the good stuff. Trust me, I am totally not biased. Let's begin with the oldest. Rome is, to this day, one of the most technically impressive games I have ever played, and its release date is baffling. 2004! Rome 1 was truly fantastic. It was an absolute masterpiece of a game that set the groundwork for a lot of things to come in the series, which are still there even today, nearly 20 years later. Even the classic 20-stack armies, something so simple and intrinsic, originates from Rome. A lot of people tout Rome's dynamic battle maps, but that's not necessarily what they are. The devs looked at this entire model of Europe they had crafted for the campaign map, and they decided to do it again, from on-foot scale, for the entire continent. 2004, by the way. For this part, I wanted to do a little bit of a live showcase of the battle maps. This is Sicily. That over there is Italy. These are the boats that I came in on. And that up there is the volcano that I can't remember the name of. I'll put the name of it on screen right now. All this was handcrafted by a developer. You can also see the roads here going to Carthage's cities over there, and this one going to the Greek cities. Also, this is a mountain, just like it is on the strategy layer. Obviously, this isn't fully one-to-one, because if it was, it would take up, you know, half of your hard drive. Just for perfect clarity, this is the original Rome running on my PC. And it's the same thing. There's Italy over there, and I can't look at it because the camera is terrible in this game, but trust me, you're gonna have to believe me that there's a volcano over there. No game since Medieval 2 has ever done this, unfortunately, which is probably due to just how taxing it was for the developers. Now you get a map from a pre-existing list that may or may not be from a different pool of maps depending on location, race, or season. Something we'll see pop up later is faction variety. Rome had really interesting faction variety. Every single faction has a diverse and interesting roster from one another. The only factions that play identically are the Roman ones, and that's only true in their roster. Each one has access to different religions, which dramatically change how you handle their city management. And obviously all of them have very different campaign objectives. Every faction has unique strengths and weaknesses, both in their roster and their buildings. Rome didn't really come with such a thing as a technology tree. What units you could train, what buildings you could produce was entirely dictated by a city's infrastructure, which itself was entirely dictated by the city's population. This is a system that sort of came back in Medieval 2, but was not as developed and has never returned since. Every man you train, every soldier added to your army, is an actual person, a taxpayer taken out of the city's population. Disband units and they go into the nearest city's population. Each city tier dictates what new infrastructure you can construct, which, you know, makes logical sense. You don't have technology. How advanced your civilization is totally dictated by how large your cities are. The way that population can move can be manipulated in a whole bunch of interesting ways. Pay peasants to become migrants and move them into a region where you can disband them. Pay mercenaries to become civilians. Cause a migrant crisis to own the Poles. Okay, this one probably isn't that viable. It's a damn shame this system has never returned. Not only does it make logical sense in the setting, it adds a whole bunch of depth to how you manage your empire in the strategy layer. Some people have tried though. Unlike future Total Wars, where one settlement miner is able to create 2 full stacks, this is literally impossible in Rome, because you could bleed your enemy of their population. It had its problems, of course. It was really jank, and pretty much all the barbarian factions were hilariously bad at managing it. All their units are massive and they just like spam them out, meaning that you walk into Western Europe in the mid-game and it's just a ghost town of minimum population settlements. Oh yeah, speaking of barbarians, Barbarian Invasion was a completely different game built on Rome's foundations. It added a bunch of new mechanics which would be still expanded upon in future entries, many of which are still included to this day in modern Total War games. It's like a pioneer for the franchise's future mechanics. For instance, Hordes originally were a mechanic that showed up here, although they are dramatically different today. Their origins showed up with the Goths, Vandals, Sarmatians, Roxolani, Slavs, Franks, Burgundy, and Lombardy. The difficulty of campaigns in this expansion also varied wildly. The Western Roman Empire campaign is probably one of the hardest in Total War's entire history, while others are a little bit more sensible. The remaster also let me play as my favorite, British Rome. It's cursed. While not necessarily specific to Barbarian Invasion, this was the best place I could find to bring this up in the script. Rome's balance is kind of scuffed, but in a really good way. Cavalry is really, really good, and units break at the first hint of a cavalry charge. They would in real life. If you see if your buddies get mowed down by heavy cavalry, you're gonna want to get the hell out of there.
The enemy general is slain, and now his men fear us. It is time to press the attack.
Every game to come after Rome has made units a lot more resilient to morale, and fights last much longer because of this. This is subjective, of course, but I heavily prefer Rome's morale system. Heavy cavalry was like the GOAT in Rome, and it was really just not anymore in future titles. In Shogun 2 especially, they're made of glass.
Your general has fallen! The men need a leader, sir!
The meta has definitely shifted towards range in the future titles, really heavily. I'll get into it later when I complain more about Warhammer 2's balance. Rome was a really exceptional game, but to explain properly why is a little difficult. It's an excellent game to me because it does so many things better than other Total War games, which, we'll get to. I would also like to quickly clarify that I do not have any nostalgia for Rome. The first time I played it was in early 2017. With that out of the way, let's jump forward straight to my subscriber percentage. Medieval 2 was built on the foundations of Rome, and is in this. When I was originally writing the script, I actually had a lot to say about Medieval 2. You can read it all right here if you really want. But going back to get the footage for this video, just as we'll see for Warhammer later, it showed me that I really totally despise playing this fucking thing. This clip in the background about sums up the entire game as far as I'm concerned. In the exceptionally brief few sessions I played, I managed to get the game to crash once from a diplomatic proposal, and overall the game feels very, very dated and has very poor controls. When Medieval 2 inevitably gets the remaster treatment like Rome got, it'll probably feel a lot less like CBD to play in the modern day. Medieval 2 is really held up by its modding scene, and man, it shows. I know that I'm biased towards liking and preferring Rome. I don't really know a solid excuse for that, but I do know this game controls and handles like shit. I really, really do not want to play this game anymore to get additional footage. I'm sorry, but there you go, there's the review. We're gonna be skipping over a few games in almost a decade here, but let's move on to the funny samurai game. Alright. First things first is very important for this video. This game has practically no support for 4K. This might not even be noticeable on YouTube, I don't even know, but in practice it makes the game look like a horrible pixelated mess. You can change it to 4K, that is an option, however none of the UI scales, so it's entirely unplayable. Quite entertainingly, Medieval 2, which came out in 2006, has better 4K support than Shogun 2 does. With that out of the way, Shogun 2 did get me into the franchise originally when it first released back in 2011. It is genuinely a very solid title, but it's definitely got problems, and it has a fair share of them. Faction diversity is the first one that comes to mind because there isn't any. You will play almost every single faction in the exact same way as all of the others, only with very minor differences. Here is an example of the unit diversity. Graphically, Shogun 2 is a massive step up in the franchise at release. With the aforementioned 4K problem, this is a lot more moot today, but for the most part the game still looks great. You can actually run it now, as you pretty much needed the equivalent of a NASA supercomputer back in 2011 to run the game at 60. Well, sort of. The frame rate still hitches when a lot of things are rendered, and by hitches I mean it dies in a ravenous fire. It's fine with only a few units, but looking more and oh yeah, the frame rate's gone. Relevant for later is the end turn speed. Just as with Rome and Medieval 2 before it, they're practically non-existent. This isn't too surprising as there aren't a huge amount of factions, but it's so unbelievably welcome after coming back from Warhammer. And don't worry, we'll be getting to that later. This game's got some balance issues. Pretty much the strongest unit in the entire game is recruited at tier 1, in every village, with no infrastructure requirements. Yari Ashigaru are hilariously overpowered, and Yari Wall could probably, disintegrate the Pentagon. As you might imagine, this really doesn't do wonders for the game balance, and you have very little incentive to recruit anything else. A lot of the more specialized units are very underwhelming, and practically everything will fall to a tier 1 unit. As previously mentioned, the handcrafted terrain is also out. This means that quite frequently you'll finish up a siege, go to defend a town 50 miles away, look around, and realizing that you're now defending the exact same pile of dirt that you just attacked, which can really take you out of it. At least the snow looks nice. Speaking of sieges, they're really awful in this game. Probably not as bad as Warhammer sieges, but just like this game, there's a there's a very distinct lack of polish that you never really get quite used to, and it never goes away either. The concept is definitely cool though, and the climbing animations are very neat. Cavalry can, for the first and only time in the franchise as far as I know, actually dismount in the game. This is really good for two reasons. A, because Cavalry in Shogun 2 is about as glass cannon as it gets without the cannon part, and the second reason is that you can send them up the walls when the time comes. Why this has never been seen again, I have no clue. Something touted a lot about Shogun 2 is the mocapped combat animations, which are genuinely quite spectacular. Even if you still have to contend with the Total War routing circle dance, which, by the way, seems to be present in every single title, watching a general get impaled is very satisfying, as is watching the actual real Oda Nobunaga slit someone's throat. Oh yeah, generals. I despise their implementation in this game. You have this unfortunate mix of mechanics where generals are made of glass, but they're also exceptionally rare. So practically every clan you will ever talk to will not have a single family member, and you might not either. The game even is aware of the fact that generals are made of paper mache, because the second your general scrapes up against anything, it will certainly let you know.
Our general is in grave danger, my lord!
The family tree is really underdeveloped and boring as well, and I genuinely, still over 10 years later, have no idea why you wouldn't adopt every single general into the family. Diplomacy theoretically exists. This might as well be a complaint against the franchise as a whole, so it's not really a Shogun 2 specific problem, but diplomacy is such a non-concern that sometimes it feels like it might as well not exist. Realm Divide in Shogun 2 specifically certainly doesn't help, where they couldn't figure out a decent way to stop the player from steamrolling and just said, alright, fuck it. After a certain point, every single person in the entire world declares war on you, regardless of your previous relations. Speaking of the end of the game, it's fine. Extremely heavily biased towards factions that start towards central Japan, but it gets the job done. Every faction does have identical endings, even though the Iko-Iki, a paid DLC faction I might add, historically were completely against setting up a shogunate and having a centralized daimyo. Something so clear to their identity that it's in the first sentence of their Wikipedia entry. And yet none of this is represented in-game, which is a little unfortunate, but understandable. Let's move on to Fall of the Samurai. Fall of Samurai was a DLC released shortly after Shogun 2, and after a few years, Creative Assembly decided there was enough of a game on its own to start selling as a standalone product, and frankly, I think they were right. Similarly to Barbarian Invasion, Fall of Samurai is based on Shogun 2's foundation, but it's a totally different game, with totally different assets, gameplay settings, mechanics, and tone. Still the same maps, though. Factions are split into two sides this time, although the differences are practically nothing. To give a brief synopsis of the setting so you can understand this, Japan had two rulers, the Shogun who actually ran the country, and the Emperor who was a figurehead. The Emperor bans all Western powers from entering Japan for any reason, and America was not a fan of that one. So the factions are split in two, with Imperial factions that support the Emperor's decision and want to keep things traditional, and then there's the Barak clan and friends who aren't idiots and are willing to widely adopt Armstrong guns. Speaking of which, something present in all titles, but is especially egregious in Fall of the Samurai, is how much of a pain in the ass missile units are to control. This is a problem from the aforementioned Armstrong guns to onagers to skirmishers to even line infantry. Like sieges, they too have an air of why doesn't this fucking work that never goes away. The large unit scale really does not help, and Fall of the Samurai units are significantly larger than the original game's counterparts. Usually, setting missile units on guard mode, hoping they pick their targets, does the job, but then you'll always get the classic experience of watching your matchlocks just kind of like gormlessly stare at enemies, and when you tell them to fire, they march towards them. In both Shogun 2's base game and in this, I found the melee combat to be really, how do I describe this? It's sticky. The combat is sticky. Like, once units collide, good luck ever getting them away from each other until one is routing. This is a problem created by two things having unfortunate side effects on one another. The first would be how Total War in general, and once again this is an aggravating problem in every Total War, just extremely accentuated here, when a single entity starts fighting another, the entire units of both gets dragged in. This, combined with Shogun 2's locked mocapped animations, means that units are bound to get caught in extended fights a lot more, which makes it significantly harder to pull them away from one another. But you know what's not aggravating? War crimes. Something 18th century Japan has got in swathes. Naval combat was like a big thing in Shogun 2, but I didn't even bother to bring it up because, they're naval battles, who cares? They control like ass and always have and probably always will. But they were further expanded on in Fall of the Samurai with a Bill Wirtz reference. They can bomb things on the strategy layer, though this has every single time I've ever used it been incredibly underwhelming, but you can also use them in combat, and that has Most certainly not been underwhelming. The quantity of shot fired is dictated by the ships in your fleet, and you start every battle with a timer on when it's usable. In sieges, of course, because you have no incentive to not stand outside, you might as well wait to fire all the barrages in first, all while your troops just kind of watch in horror. Or you could fire after you get men on the walls. You know, for fun. I'm surprised how little I have to say on Fall of the Samurai. It was a good addition to Shogun 2 that, like a Barbarian Invasion before it built on the ideas of the original in completely new ways. With the classic Total War jank in there, of course. So, with Warhammer 3 like an afternoon away, I have a massive segment on my thoughts on its progenitor, Warhammer 2. And as I've sort of implied throughout this video, there are certainly complex thoughts. With my Star Sector video exploding out of nowhere and how long this video already is, the Warhammer bit will be its own video. I might also make another video on Rome, because there are a lot of things about it, like the Marian reforms, that I didn't quite get to cover here. After that, I don't know, Empire at War? Anyway, press the funny YouTube algorithm buttons, send me money, and have a good one.